Hello everyone, I welcome you all in this course Introduction to Sequence Stratigraphy, and in this particular lecture we are going to discuss about the fluvial environment. Definitely in this course, as it is focused on sequence stratigraphy, we have a very limited scope of going into the detailed phases model and the depositional process that commonly goes on in fluvial environment, and also within a very small time available with us for discussing on this particular topic. So, I cannot go into the detail of fluvial architectural elements, I cannot go into the detail of fluvial depositional environments, processes and the phases models. So, in this lecture, I will try to give you a very brief idea about the different architecture in terms of sequence stratigraphy. That is, what are the different types of systems tracked that we can observe, that you can get in a fluvial environment. As we have already gone through the entire marine environment, particularly the siliciclastic environments, and there we have already seen that how the base level changes affect the depositional conditions and the distribution of different depositional systems with respect to that change. So, in today's class, I will try to give you a brief overview about what happens in the fluvial environment in response to the base level change as well as independent of base level change. So, whenever you talk about a fluvial system, whether it is a braided river system, whether it is a meandering river system, that deposition within the fluvial system, it is always controlled by several factors. Definitely the autogenic factors are the major factors, for example, the fluvial current flow, the water discharge, the energy of the flow. So, these are definitely the primary control which will determine what will be the nature of distribution of phases at different parts of the river flow. The energy condition will also control whether there will be erosion or there will be deposition. So, autogenic control have a direct influence on sedimentation, but apart from the autogenic controls, allogenic controls, they can have a very strong influence, a very strong control on sedimentation process in the fluvial systems. Now, what are the possible allogenic controls? The dominant one is the climate, because we know climatic changes in the continental areas, they can have a severe effect which can control the discharge of river valley water, which can control the weathering pattern, that will control how much sediment will be derived, how much sediment will be supplied. So, when we are talking about the supply of sediments, definitely the tectonism in the source area, that becomes very important, because if somewhere some exhumation is going on, that area will become more prone for weathering process, erosion process. If somewhere the area is down sagging, that area will have less amount of weathering, and also the basin subsidence. So, these are some major controls. Apart from these controls which are confined only in the continental part, we can also have marine controls like marine sea level changes, eustacy. So, any eustatic sea level change will control the river profile, will affect the river profile, and already we have discussed during our classes on different types of systems tracked that whenever there is a change in the sea level, the graded profile of the river, that will try to adjust itself, and in order to do that, the gradient of the river equilibrium profile will change, and that change will lead to change in the balance between erosion and deposition. So, several allogenic factors, allogenic controls, they control, they determine what will be the nature of fluvial depositional systems. So, the relative importance of these allogenic controls on creation of the fluvial accommodation can vary from the source area to the shoreline, because the conditions, their effects are different at different areas. Say for example, if we are talking about the source area, there maybe the tectonic effect may be very severe. So, it can control the slope of that particular area, it can control the amount of erosion going on over there, and it will control the accommodation available over there. Whereas, when we come near to the shoreline, there the control may be more by the base level change, by the sea level change. So, near to the shoreline, the accommodation in the fluvial system will be controlled more by the sea level changes. The importance of the allogenic controls on creation of the fluvial accommodation is changing, it is varying from area to area across the river valley, across the river depositional system, and that variation controls the nature of sedimentation across the river valley. In response to these changes, river itself changes its nature. Initially, we can get an alluvial fan which can be changed into a braided river, which can be changed into a meandering river. Within meandering river also we can get different types of morphologies. There may be different balances in between the erosion and deposition within the meandering river systems. So, definitely allogenic controls have a very strong control on the fluvial accommodation creation. So, whenever we try to apply the sequence stratigraphic concepts in the fluvial systems, we have to think of where we are applying this. Depending on this nature of accommodation, depending on this nature of control, the sequence model will change. The architecture of the sedimentation, the architecture of the sediment packages which are forming will change. So, whenever we try to apply the sequence stratigraphic concepts in fluvial systems, we have to first look at in which part of the river we are trying to apply this concept, and in that particular part what are the dominant controls on the fluvial processes, because that will determine what is the resultant accommodation available for sedimentation in that particular area of the river system. So, very often we put emphasis on eustasy and tectonism. Just now I have given you the example. So, eustasy and tectonism, they have a very important role to play in controlling the river accommodation, fluvial accommodation, and depending on their influences we can develop sequence models which will predict the nature of variations in the depositional trends that will control what will be the fluvial styles in relation to changes in the marine accommodation. Because when we are talking about the eustasy, it is the sea level change, it is the base level change occurring in the marine basin which is controlling the fluvial graded profile, which is controlling the accommodation in the fluvial system. So, whenever we put emphasis on eustasy and tectonism, basically we are depending on the marine accommodation creation by change in the marine base level and its effect on the fluvial system. On the other hand, when you look into the effect of climatic changes, they can have different effects in different parts, as there can be different influences of these climatic changes in different parts of the river valley. So, based on the effects of climate, we can find out variations in the sediment supply, variations in the river discharge, variations in the vegetation cover, and all these factors will control the change in or variation in the depositional trends that will control what will be the dominant fluvial style, and based on that the facies architecture, the nature of the depositional system will vary, will change. So, when we put emphasis on the climatic changes as a factor, as the controlling factor, in such conditions the facies model and the resultant sequence model will be different. So, what kind of allogenic factors are responsible? That is very important for fluvial system, and in which part we are looking at, that is another very important factor in fluvial sequence stratigraphy. So, when we talk about the marine base level changes and the associated shoreline shifts, which is commonly associated with base level rise or fall, that can commonly influence the fluvial processes, as we have already seen during our discussions on different types of systems tracts in the marginal marine system. There already we have seen that along with the fall there can be incision of the river valley, There can be rise of the base level that can result in backfilling of the river valley, that can result in formation of estuary, that can result in change from braided river to meandering river system. So, all these processes, all these changeovers are possible, are common in fluvial systems when it is closely associated with the marine base level changes, when it is directly affected by the marine base level changes. Now, where we can get this effect? We can get this effect up to a limited distance in the upstream direction from the shoreline, up to that extent where we get this effect of base level change in the form of some marine processes. What can be the most common marine process? Tidal influences, because tidal current can move into the river channel. As these are current system, they can move upstream, they can move landward through the river channel up to certain extent, and up to that distance, up to that extent where we get this effect of tide, we can get an effect of fluvial changeover. Not only that, even because of this changeover in the shoreline area in terms of base level change, there will be an overall change in the fluvial graded profile. When the base level is going down, the fluvial graded profile will try to come down through incision, and already we have seen that when this kind of incision takes place, the subaerial unconformity that forms, it extends towards the basinward direction as well as it extends towards the landward direction through gradual migration of the fluvial neck points. This already we have discussed. So, the fall of the base level is controlling the distribution pattern or the processes within the fluvial system. So, that can be controlled up to certain distance, certain extent towards the landward direction. Similarly, when we get base level rise, the fluvial grade profile will also rise, and that will lead to decrease in the gradient of the river profile, which will lead to decrease in the supply of sand size or coarser grain materials. That will decrease the amount of supply of sediments into the river mouth area or into the river channels. This also we have discussed during our classes on HST, during our classes on LST, TST, there we have seen this happens. So, in this kind of condition, again the effect of base level change, the effect of base level rise is affecting the river channel up to certain extent. So, whenever we talk about or we try to relate the marine base level changes with associated shoreline shift to the fluvial depositional conditions, we can do that, we can effectively relate that up to a certain limited distance towards the landward direction. How much is the distance? It can vary. It can vary from basin to basin, it can vary from river valley to river valley, it can vary depending on what is the nature of the gradient of that particular river valley, what is the extent of a marine base level change. So, it can range from tens of kilometers, can even range up to hundreds of kilometers in certain rivers where the overall profile is really showing very low gradient. So, it can really vary. But beyond that distance, where this effect of base level change is not showing any direct effect, beyond that distance we do not get any changeover with respect to base level change. But that does not mean that there will be no effect in terms of sequence stratigraphy, there will be no effect in terms of accommodation creation. There will be accommodation creation, but the controls are different. There the allogenic factors are different. So, in those conditions, in those kind of scenario, we have to define a separate system, we have to consider them separately for fluvial systems. So, in the overall course of a river, and particularly when we talk about the fluvial portion of a sedimentary basin, if we live behind the river mouth area, that we can divide into two distinct portions, two distinct areas. One part we call it as the downstream controlled system, downstream controlled fluvial system, where we commonly get the influence of base level change. So, if I define this with respect to the entire river valley, then from the source area, from the start point of the river, this is the distal area where we get these downstream controlled conditions, downstream controlled fluvial systems. And if I consider that portion which is beyond the zone of base level change, which is beyond the zone of this effect of base level change in the fluvial system. So, we are moving more towards the proximal part of the fluvial system with respect to the source area, and that area is called as the upstream controlled fluvial system. So, the entire fluvial system can be divided into these two subunits or sub areas: downstream controlled fluvial system and upstream controlled fluvial system. The control of the allogenic factors and the control of the base level change are completely different in these two areas. In the downstream controlled area, there is a direct effect of base level change, and when I am talking about base level, it is the marine base level change. In the upstream controlled part, there is no direct effect of marine base level change. So, there are other allogenic factors which are responsible for the creation of accommodation. So, fluvial systems, those which are under the influence of the downstream controls, commonly respond to the interplay of or the changes, fluctuations in the sea level conditions. I am talking about the relative sea level obviously. They can also be affected by basin subsidence, and here the basin subsidence means the entire basin including the marine basin, and fluctuations in the energy condition which is dominant in different environmental conditions, which can be in response to the dominant climatic shifts in that entire basin. In such settings, the fluvial processes can go through incisions, fluvial systems can go through aggradations, fluvial systems can go through backfilling, which we call as fluvial onlap. These changes go on in a very predictable manner. When I am saying predictable, because we can predict that with respect to the changing base level condition, because they are directly related to the base level changes. As already we have seen the different types of systems tracked: HST, FSST, LST and TST. So, there already we have discussed how the fluvial system also reacts, what are the responses of the fluvial system in those individual system strats. And we have seen that any changes in the shoreline, any changes in the coastal area, any changes in the shelf area are directly or indirectly affecting the fluvial depositional systems. So, with the pattern of shoreline shift and the associated depositional processes in the coastal and marine environments control the fluvial depositional pattern, that may be incision, that may be aggradation, that may be retrogradation, that may be progradation. So, this changeover is to some extent predictable when we relate that with the corresponding base level change, when you relate that with the corresponding shoreline trajectory. So, these fluvial systems can be very easily integrated within the standard sequence stratigraphic models. When I am talking about standard sequence stratigraphic model, that means the model that we have discussed so far, that we apply for common silicic marine systems, where we commonly define the low stand systems tract, the transgressive systems tract, the high stand systems tract, and we try to correlate them with respect to the normal base level change with respect to that base level curve, and we try to understand what are the changes occurring. So, when we are talking about the downstream controlled fluvial systems, there straightway we can apply the same concept, we can apply the same model of sequence stratigraphy, we can apply the same ideas of defining low stand systems tract, transgressive systems tract or high stand systems tract. Definitely the architecture of the depositional system will be different. When I compare that with respect to a shelf or with respect to a deep basinal area or with respect to a shore environment, or maybe a delta or estuary environment that is associated with the base level change, the corresponding fluvial systems will be different in terms of appearance, in terms of the architecture of the depositional system, but we can correlate them. So, if I try to understand what happens during this kind of downstream controlled fluvial systems, where change in base level is affecting the fluvial depositional processes and producing the resultant products. So, we are again referring to that ideal base level curve, this base level curve. So, we are starting from here, the falling stage. Let us see what happens during the falling stage. So, during the falling stage, when the base level is falling at very high rate, we can think of a river valley. Say for example, if this is the river valley. So, these are the overbank areas. Now, in this river valley or river channel, the water level is going down in order to adjust with respect to the corresponding base level fall. So, in order to go down, in order to that adjustment, the channel system will try to erode or downcut, and it will downcut in this way, and finally what we get is a system like this. So, when this kind of downcutting is going on, what we expect is formation of terrace, river terrace system. So, in river terrace system we get this kind of downcutting. So, we get this kind of terrace systems developed through fluvial incision. Now, these interfluve areas or the overbank areas, they are not under any cover. Earlier they were part of the overbanks. So, in these areas already mud is deposited or fine grained sediments are deposited, and since these are now going through this bypass process, so what we expect here is formation of paleosols. Pedogenic process will start, and finally in the rock record we will get them as paleosols. So, when this base level fall is going on in the river system, what we are getting is this particular surface which is the definitely is the subaerial unconformity, which is forming through river incision. There we can get river terrace formation, we can get paleosol formation in the interfluve areas, and formation of subaerial unconformity. So, this is the scenario that we expect during the falling stage, during the base level fall, which can be correlated to the forced regressive phase in the marine system. Now, the representation of this already we have discussed during our discussion on FSST. We have seen that how this kind of fluvial system they incise, how the tributaries also incise during this phase, and how the unconformity, subaerial unconformity that is forming, it gradually expands. So, I am not going to that part again. Now, if I look into the second part, when the base level starts rising up, so now we are looking at this part of the base level curve, which we already know. This is the LST, already we know about that. This is the LST, when the base level has started rising. So, in this case what is happening? Now, the river water is coming over here. So, as a result of that, now the river channel is getting some accommodation, though the accommodation is low, but it is getting accommodation where the river channels will try to amalgamate, will try to deposit sediments. So, definitely these have started from here and gradually it is rising up. So, at the initial part the river channels will be smaller and they will try to amalgamate very quickly. As the accommodation is gradually created, as you are moving up this curve, accommodation is created at higher rate. So, with time you are getting more accommodation. So, there we get more larger channels and they will try to amalgamate together without much of overbank deposits. So, this kind of channel fill deposits will characterize this LST part. What is happening in the interflow areas? These areas are still without any water, without underwater cover, and that is why this paleosol formation will continue. Maybe in between these amalgamated channels, we can get some localized paleosols, which we commonly call as the wet paleosols, immature paleosols, maybe occasionally some coal formations. So, they will be associated in between these channel systems wherever we are getting some overbanks. So, we can consider these intermittent white portions, these are the overbank deposits. So, this is happening during the LST phase. So, what we are getting over here? We are getting amalgamated channel fills within a very limited accommodation, number 1, and number 2, formation of paleosols in the interflow areas. Again, it is going on. But the river channel has started amalgamating. That is the changeover with respect to the falling stage, the 4th regressive phase. Now, if I look at the transgressive phase, so now we are looking at over here in this part of the curve, or maybe we are looking at over here, this part of the curve. You can consider any one of this. We are looking at this part of the base level curve. So, now the base level or the river channel has reached up to this. So, what is happening now? The river system is getting ample of sufficient amount of accommodation, and not only that, that accommodation is actually affected by very frequent tidal influences, tidal current, because now the shoreline is trying to encroach in. So, these channels, they will now be affected by frequent tidal channels. These yellow colored channel systems are the tidally influenced channel systems. So, this kind of tidal channels will form, and we will get overbanks. Overbanks will try to cover up these channels. As we go up within the transgressive part, more accommodation is created now. So, there will be more frequent flooding, and when there will be more frequent flooding, there will be more frequent floodplain deposits, overbank deposits, and in between that there will be some isolated channels like this. Those channels will be affected by tidal currents. So, what is the overall summary for the transgressive part in fluvial system? So, basically we are getting tidally influenced channels which are aggrading, and this aggradation is helped by frequent overbank deposits. That is the characteristic of the TST part. So, this is the TST part, this earlier one, the green color part is the LST part, and the subaerial unconformity is the FSST part. Now, finally, I am looking into this part, which is the HST part, or maybe I am looking at over here in this part. When the base level is at its maximum, is reaching to its maximum, but gradually the rate of change of base level is decreasing with respect to sediment supply. So, what is happening now? Base level is at its maximum now, very high base level condition, but gradually the sedimentation rate is trying to overpace the rate of rise of the base level. So, what will happen in this kind of condition? Initially huge amount of accommodation is available, so that will be covered up by frequent flooding events, and that will be covered up by overbanks. In between these overbanks, there will be few isolated channels which may be tidally affected. But as we move upward, gradually the rate of sedimentation will be increasing, and when rate of sedimentation is increasing over the rate of rise of the base level, the accommodation will get consumed, the accommodation will get occupied by these channel systems. So, that consumption of accommodation will gradually increase as we move towards the upper part of the HST. So, in that part gradually what will get? More abundance of this kind of channel systems, where in between there can be some overbank deposits, and finally these channel systems will again start amalgamating with less amount of overbanks, because in this part the accommodation is totally consumed by the sediments which are supplied in these river systems. So, in this HST part what we are getting? There is the overall amalgamation of the channel system, and the abundance of amalgamation of channel system will gradually increase towards the upper part of the HST. So, this is the HST part, and then what we also get is abundance of the overbank deposits towards the basal part of the HST, which will gradually decrease upward. There will be not much of paleosols that will form over here in this kind of scenario. So, after this again we are coming back to this falling stage, and during this falling stage again the river will start cutting down and will again come back over here. Now, what will be the nature of cutting? That will depend on how much is the fall, how the river is reacting to that, and based on that any portion of this deposit that has formed during one cycle may get eroded or partially preserved, and this cycle will go on. So, when we look into the downstream controlled part of the fluvial system, we get this kind of systematic changeover starting from falling stage, which is represented by subaerial unconformity, followed by a distinct LST, TST and HST, which are characterized with respect to different types of or different ratios of channel is to overbank deposits. Also, as we move upward, the change in terms of abundance of tidal influence, that also varies gradually as we move upward from LST to HST. So, overall these are the characteristics of the downstream controlled fluvial systems, and these are the architecture of the system strats. When we look into the stratal stacking pattern in upstream control settings, they can develop beyond the influence of relative sea level changes, commonly in response to the introduction of several allogenic factors. So, those factors like tectonics, like climate, they can modify the balance between the sediment supply and the dominant energy flux in different parts of the river system. So, when this balance is changing between the sediment supply and the energy flux, what we commonly get is the change in the accommodation. So, what are the common factors that maintains this balance? So, definitely the climatic changes, definitely the tectonisms in the source area, and also several autogenic control factors which commonly controls the sediment dispersal patterns over various time scales. And all these factors together controls what will be the amount of accommodation created in the fluvial system, and that will determine how much will be the sedimentation. So, when I look into the depositional trend in the upstream controlled areas, it is bit simple. It is not that complicated when I compare that with respect to the downstream controlled fluvial system. So, here we can have, say we can have the reference point, reference line, which we can consider as the reference line for the fluvial graded profile. So, there can be downgrading. So, when there will be downgrading, there will be erosion in the channel system and followed by the interfluvials. So, again in the interfluvials we will get paleosols will be forming over here, and this part is definitely the unconformity. So, in this area the incision process is going on in this entire area, when it is the downgrading or it is the erosion process is going on, deposition is not going on. So, in this kind of condition the accommodation is negative and there is no scope of accumulation of sediments in this kind of scenario. When there is a scope for sedimentation, then we can have two different conditions. So, scenario 1, when we have some accommodation created by tectonics, by climatic changes, by autogenic factors and by the overall condition of the river equilibrium profile. So, when we have accommodation created, but that accommodation is limited, in such condition we should have very quick amalgamation of the channel systems. Channel systems will try to amalgamate very quickly within, say if this is the entire basin deposit, these are the overbank deposits. So, in this part the channel is to overbank. So, here this ratio of channel is to overbank is very high. channel will amalgamate, and this is a very low accommodation available over here. Since the accommodation is low, so channels will amalgamate, it will not be flooded condition, so overbank deposits will be low. There can be another condition where we can have a higher accommodation, more accommodation available, and in that condition maybe we can have this much of space available. So definitely the channels, they will not amalgamate that much, they will be separated, and in between that we will have significant amount of overbank deposits. So in this kind of condition, channel is to overbank, that ratio is significantly low. Channel is to overbank ratio here is significantly low. So in this kind of condition, amalgamation of channels will not be that abundant, that dominant, rather it will be more dominated by the overbank deposits. So the degree of this channel amalgamation is a key element in defining the stratal stacking pattern in upstream controlled fluvial systems. So amalgamation is controlled by availability of the accommodation. So how much is the accommodation available, how much is the accommodation created, and how the sediments are consuming that accommodation, that will determine what will be the ratio of channel is to overbank, and based on that we can get whether there will be high amalgamation of the channels or there will be low amalgamation of the channels. Now when I am talking about low amalgamation of the channels, that means channels are isolated then. So whether we will get amalgamated channels or whether we get isolated channels. The ratio between this channel and the overbank depositional conditions, overbank depositional systems, this is commonly the outcome of the interplay of some of the processes, some of the conditions in the fluvial systems. Commonly we can find out three major processes. One, the rate of floodplain aggradation, that means how much flooding is going on, how much accommodation is available there, and based on that how frequently flooding event is going on, so that floodplain deposits gets aggregated. Second one, the degree of channel confinement, because that will control how much will be the shifting of the channel and amalgamation of the channel, and the frequency of avulsion by the channels, which will determine that how much will be the shifting of channel system itself within the overbank deposits. So these three factors, the floodplain aggradation, channel confinement and avulsion, these three are the three controlling factor which controls, which determines that even after the creation of accommodation, how much that accommodation will be consumed by the channel system, and depending on that what will be the resultant ratio of channel is to overbank. So early studies which tried to classify this stratal stacking pattern in the fluvial systems, particularly the upstream controlled fluvial systems, they commonly proposed a direct link between the accommodation condition and the degree of channel amalgamation, and based on that they commonly identified or classified two major system strats. One is the low accommodation system strat, LAST, and second one high accommodation system strat, the HAST. So in this diagram I will call this one, this portion where we are getting the channel amalgamation high, channel is to overbank ratio high with a very low accommodation, I will call this one as low accommodation system strat, LAST, whereas this one I will give name HAST, high accommodation system strat, because in this case the accommodation is high, channel is to overbank ratio is low, channel amalgamation is low. So two different system strats were initially defined, HAST high accommodation system strat, LAST low accommodation system strat. But later on this approach was considered or found as kind of oversimplification, because as I have told you that accommodation creation is one factor, but how much that accommodation will be consumed by the channel depositional process, that depends on other factors as well, like avulsion, like the overbank aggradation, like the channel confinement, which are very important factor. So, these factors were not considered when these two systems tracts were defined. So, nowadays a more descriptive nomenclature is used. So, that particular nomenclature is more popular nowadays, and based on that we commonly define nowadays two different stacking pattern. One is the high amalgamation stacking pattern. Earlier this was used to be called as the low accommodation systems tract. So, earlier LAST is now refreshed, renamed as high amalgamation stacking pattern. So, in this kind of stacking pattern, high degree of channel amalgamation in the fluvial systems is commonly expected, where we get high channel to overbank ratio, and these are commonly caused by low rates of floodplain aggradations, commonly abundance of unconfined channels, and high frequency of channel avulsions. The second one, when we talk about the HAST, that means the high accommodation systems tract, these are now redefined as low amalgamation stacking pattern, which is floodplain dominated, where we get isolated channels within floodplain deposits, and they were previously referred to as high accommodation systems tract HAST or high accommodation stacking pattern. So, the second type is the low amalgamation stacking pattern. So, in this kind of stacking pattern, the low degree of channel amalgamation is observed. We commonly get a very low channel to overbank ratio, which are commonly caused by or triggered by high rates of floodplain aggradation, commonly triggered by more confined channels and low frequency of channel avulsions. As I have told you at the very beginning, we do not have much scope of going into the detail of the fluvial architecture, the fluvial depositional systems, fluvial facies models. So, I will stop the discussion on fluvial sequence stratigraphy over here at this point. So, in this class we have tried to understand the major controls that determines the architecture of fluvial systems, that determines the accommodation creation in fluvial systems, which can be varying from area to area within the fluvial depositional system, and so based on that we can define a downstream controlled and upstream controlled fluvial systems. When you look into the downstream controlled fluvial systems, these are directly affected by marine base level changes, and there we can directly apply the same concepts of sequence stratigraphy, the same sequence models as we have applied for siliciclastic marine systems. When we look into the upstream controlled fluvial systems, there the control factors are different, and there the accommodation creation is controlled by some allogenic factors, may be associated with some autogenic factors, and there we can define the systems tract based on whether the channels are getting amalgamated or they are isolated, whether the channel to overbank ratio is high or low, and how much they are covering up, consuming the accommodation created over there, which is controlled by channel avulsion, which is controlled by confined or unconfined nature of the channels, which is controlled by nature of amalgamation of the channels or the floodplain deposits. So, overall the sequence model for upstream controlled and downstream controlled fluvial systems are distinctly different. So, these are some of the references for further study on this particular topic. Thank you everyone.